The story begins, as so many of Louisiana's most unsettling tales do, with a house. Not merely a house, but a structure that stood like a dark sentinel on the western edge of Vermilion Parish, half sunken into the marshes and hemmed in by moss-laden cypress trees. Local people called it Maison Duval, though on maps of the time it appeared as Duval's Crossing Plantation. The name derived from its position at a narrow ford in the bayou, a place where travelers were forced to halt and reckon with the family who claimed dominion there. By 1863, Maison Duval had been standing for nearly 70 years. Unlike the grand colonnade estates one sees in tourist paintings, the Duval house was severe and fortress-like. Thick brick walls rising from a stone foundation, shutters perpetually half-closed, and iron gates at the property line that gave the impression of a prison more than a home. A wide veranda encircled the lower floor, but visitors often remarked that the veranda seemed less a place of leisure and more a watchtower from which the family could monitor everything approaching on the long dirt road. Inside, the rooms were heavy with draperies and French furnishings imported during the elder Duval's lifetime. Oil portraits of stiff-faced ancestors loomed over every corridor, their eyes painted with such precision that generations of children whispered they shifted to follow intruders. In the library, a collection of medical treatises, alchemical volumes, and old family registers lined the shelves, documents that in later decades would take on an importance far beyond what anyone present in 18. The master of this house was Etienne Duval, a man who by then had lived through 67 harsh Louisiana summers. Age had not softened him. Survivors described him as tall, gaunt, with a narrow face, and eyes the color of river silt, eyes that seemed to carry both fire and decay. He had inherited the plantation not merely as property, but as the seat of what he considered a sacred bloodline. That word bloodline appears again and again in the fragments of letters and diaries left from the period. To Etienne, lineage was not simply a matter of pride, it was the instrument of power, an unbroken chain that must be preserved at any cost. By 1863, the Civil War had thrown Louisiana into turmoil. Union troops controlled New Orleans, Confederate forces patrolled the countryside, and enslaved people were fleeing by the thousands toward freedom. Yet on the Duval estate, life appeared curiously insulated from the chaos. Cotton still left the gin house, guarded by hired men who owed their livelihoods to Etienne's wealth. Carriages still came and went under cover of night, bringing visitors whose faces were hidden by hoods or heavy veils. And the family cemetery, an enclosure of high stone walls and wrought iron gates, continued to receive burials at an unusual frequency, though parish records list only a fraction of the deaths that neighbors swore had occurred. It was into this setting that Etienne's granddaughter, Isabelle Duval, found herself thrust. Born in 1847, she was just 16 in the spring of 18. Her parents had died under circumstances that remain obscure, the father supposedly from fever during a trip to Havana, the mother from a sudden decline only months later. Their deaths left Isabelle the sole female heir of the Duval estate, and thus the focus of her grandfather's obsession with preserving the family line. Descriptions of Isabelle are rare, but one letter written by a Union officer who glimpsed her during a patrol survived. He called her a girl of striking pallor, with eyes too old for her youth, who seemed to drift rather than walk across the gallery of that dreadful house. Another account from a neighboring planter's daughter described Isabelle as quiet, dutiful, and strangely isolated. She never visited, never joined in socials, never attended mass after her mother's passing. They kept her as if she was some relic not to be touched. Etienne, by contrast, remained vigorous in his social dealings. In April of that year, he hosted a gathering at Maison Duval, ostensibly to discuss wartime shortages with neighboring planters. But one guest, a French-born physician named Vauquelin, later confided to an associate that the meeting concerned arrangements of a different nature, arrangements not meant for the ears of outsiders. The doctor's notes, recovered decades later in a private collection, hint darkly at a ceremony planned for October of that year, a ceremony that would unite the blood of ancestor and descendant. It is here that whispers of the forbidden marriage first emerge. The first signs, the earliest explicit reference, comes from a letter preserved in the Saint Martin Parish archives, dated May 3. It was written by Reverend Paul Fournier, a Catholic priest, whose parish included several plantations in the region. In it he complained to a fellow cleric in New Orleans, "I have been approached by Monsieur Etienne Duval with a most irregular request. He speaks of preparing a sacrament of marriage, yet his intended bride is none other than his own granddaughter." I scarcely believed my ears. When I objected, he grew furious, speaking of blood purity and divine mandate. "I fear this man has lost all reason." The girl herself appears pale and frightened, but mute in his presence. The letter was never answered. Within months, Reverend Fournier was transferred unexpectedly to a remote parish near the Texas border. Local gossip held that Etienne had used his considerable wealth and influence to arrange the reassignment. Isabel's own voice is almost absent from the record. A single diary fragment, recovered from a trunk in the ruins of Maison Duval decades later, provides the only glimpse into her thoughts. Grandpère speaks always of destiny. He tells me our family is chosen, that my parents' deaths were but the price for a greater future. I tremble when he looks at me, for I feel I am no longer seen as child, nor woman, but as some vessel he means to bind to his will. The walls of this house close tighter each day. The fragment ends abruptly, as though torn from the book. No further entries have been found. The plantation's reputation, even before rumors of Etienne's intentions spread, the Duval estate carried an ominous reputation. Enslaved people spoke of nocturnal gatherings in the old sugar barn, where torches burned until dawn and chants echoed across the cane field. Field hands who tried to flee were pursued with unusual vigor, often returned in chains by mysterious riders who appeared from the swamps without warning. Several accounts preserved in WPA interviews, a century later, mentioned the white-robed men of Duval's Crossing, figures who forced captives to dig graves by moonlight before vanishing back into the trees. Neighbors, too, regarded the family with suspicion. One planter from Iberia Parish wrote in his ledger that Etienne Duval has dealings beyond the natural order. His people do not die as ours do. Their illnesses are concealed, their graves unmarked. He speaks of eternity when he drinks, and I fear he means. When Union forces began conducting raids through Vermilion Parish in mid-1863, Maison Duval was conspicuously spared. Some officers attributed this to Etienne's bribes. Others whispered of more sinister arrangement. An unverified report claims that Union scouts who attempted to approach the house disappeared without trace. Their horses found days later grazing untethered near the bayou. Toward October, by the summer of 1863, the outlines of Etienne's plan were becoming clear to those who lived within his orbit. Isabel was kept increasingly secluded, her movements restricted to the upper floors of the house. Servants were dismissed or reassigned, replaced by men loyal only to her grandfather. Carpenters and masons were brought in under pretense of repairing storm damage, but they worked exclusively in the basement chambers, rooms no outsider had entered in decades. One laborer who later deserted Confederate service told investigators he had glimpsed altars being constructed below the house, stone platforms carved with symbols he did not recognize. He swore he had seen a dress, white, finely sewn, laid out upon one of these altars. His story was dismissed at the time as superstition, but in the context of what would later occur takes on chilling significance. Throughout these months, Isabel's isolation deepened. Letters addressed to friends never reached their destinations. Neighbors who called at the gate were turned away with curt explanations, yet traces of her desperation survived in hidden places. A scrap of linen discovered in the attic decades later bore words stitched in trembling hand, "Help me." October comes. What drove Etienne to conceive such a union with his granddaughter remains the subject of speculation. Some historians argue it was madness born of age and arrogance, others that it was rooted in long-standing practices of endogamy among powerful families seeking to preserve wealth. Yet among the African-American community, the explanation passed down through generations was simpler. Etienne sought immortality. According to oral tradition, he believed that marrying his blood to itself, sealing the circle of ancestry, would grant his line eternal dominion. The marriage then was not merely a crime of incest, but a ritual act meant to bind generations to his will. By September of 1863, preparations for the ceremony were nearly complete. Invitations veiled in language of secrecy were dispatched to select allies. Supplies of gunpowder and chemicals were quietly amassed in outbuildings, their purpose unclear, and Isabel, trapped in her grandfather's house, counted the days until October 13th, the date etched in her mind with mounting dread. Conclusion to Part 1. Thus the stage was set, a decaying mansion on the edge of the bayou, a patriarch consumed by obsession, a granddaughter imprisoned by blood and circumstance, and a community that whispered but dared not interfere. What followed in the weeks leading to October 13th would unravel the Duval legacy and stain Louisiana history with one of its most forbidden secrets. The record grows darker from here, and the fragments we possess, letters, diary scraps and investigative notes, form the only lantern light in a corridor of shadows. The summer of 1863 burned hotter than most. The swamps around Vermilion Parish swollen with insects, fever and decay. To outsiders the season passed in its usual violence. Cane fields baking, livestock collapsing in the heat, soldiers moving like ghosts along the roads. Yet within the walls of Maison Duval a different kind of heat gathered, not the sun's heat but the oppressive pressure of secrets carried from chamber to chamber, from locked desk drawers to shuttered windows. What remained hidden from public knowledge was the deliberate nature of Etienne Duval's preparation. His household was reshaped for one purpose alone, the ceremony of October 13th. Every resource bent toward this goal, every servant's task reoriented to serve a plan none of them could fully name aloud. They lived under his gaze, and his gaze permitted no disobedience. The house transformed. The basement, long a store for tools and root vegetables, became a place of constant activity. Neighbors remarked on the smell that carried on evening winds. Sulfur, lime, wagon loads of supplies came from New Orleans under escort, unloaded in silence by hired men. Etienne forbade his enslaved laborers from approaching the lower rooms, warning that any intrusion would bring consequences. Yet several did approach, if only out of curiosity. One man, whose testimony was preserved in the 1930s during WPA interviews, remembered peering through a half-open door and glimpsing stone tables arranged in a circle, candles fixed in iron holders, and an assortment of medical tools laid out as though for surgery. Not for the fields, not for the body, he recalled whispering. They was making ready for something else, something old. He fled the plantation within weeks, joining Union lines, but his words survived in fragments passed through his descendant. Above ground, the house itself took on an air of seclusion. Heavy drapes sealed windows even in daylight, casting rooms in perpetual dusk. The grand hall, once used for entertaining visiting planters, was stripped of furniture. Crates of wine and preserved food were stacked against the walls as though the family prepared for siege. Those who visited claimed that every sound echoed unnaturally, as if the building itself had hollowed out in expectation. Isabelle's captivity. For Isabelle, Etienne's granddaughter, life narrowed to a few locked rooms on the second floor. Isabelle's last resistance. On October 5th, a week before the appointed date, Isabelle attempted escape. This event, though largely suppressed in official records, emerges in fragments from correspondence between Union officers stationed in New Iberia. One lieutenant reported intercepting a young woman disheveled and barefoot on the road at night. She pleaded for protection, naming herself Isabelle Duval and insisting her grandfather intended to wed her against her will. The officers, uncertain whether she spoke truth or madness, escorted her briefly to their camp. But within hours armed men from Maison Duval arrived, presenting papers signed by parish officials declaring Isabelle a minor under her grandfather's guardianship. Faced with potential charges of abduction, the soldiers surrendered her. Isabelle's voice was silenced again, returned to the house whose walls had already become her tomb. After her failed attempt, Etienne tightened his hold. Guards doubled, locks reinforced. Her meals brought by loyal servants who never met her gaze. He visited her daily, speaking of vows and eternity. Witnesses claimed he grew more frenzied as the date neared, his health deteriorating, his speech peppered with fragments of scripture twisted into justification. He spoke not only of marriage but of rebirth. With you, Isabelle, the circle closes. What was begun with my grandfather shall be perfected in us. Through you our line becomes unbreakable. The world will fall to ruin, but the Duvals shall remain. These words, recorded later by a servant who overheard, reveal the depth of Etienne's obsession. To him, the war outside meant nothing. The only battle that mattered was within his house, the struggle to bind past and future into one unholy union. October approaches. As the final week dawned, preparations intensified. Carriages arrived daily, bringing cloaked figures who vanished into the cellar. Fires burned night after night. The house's windows glowed like embers in the swamp. Locals kept their distance, muttering prayers when forced to pass the road. On October 12th, the eve of the appointed day, Isabelle was dressed in the white gown prepared for her. Servants described her face as ashen as the grave, her lips moving soundlessly as she was led to a locked chamber to await the morning. Etienne, meanwhile, oversaw the last arrangements below. Powder kegs lined the vault walls, hidden beneath draped cloth. Chemical jars gleamed by candlelight, and upon the central table lay a book, old, leather-bound, its script indecipherable to modern eyes. The stage was set, the guests were gathered, and October 13th approached with a silence heavier than any storm. Conclusion to Part 2. Thus the preparations reached their fevered climax. The plantation was no longer a home but a crucible, in which family, ritual, and violence fused into one purpose. Isabelle's escape had failed. Etienne's obsession had triumphed, at least for the moment. All paths now led to the appointed day. What occurred when that morning broke would ensure that the name Duval passed into Louisiana's most whispered legends. October 13, 1863 broke not with sunlight, but with fog. Heavy mists rolled in from the Vermilion River, blanketing cane fields and swamps alike in a shroud so dense that even the roosters crowed late. Survivors of that morning often remarked how it seemed the world itself hesitated to turn, as though the day resisted its own birth. Within Maison Duval, the house stirred long before dawn. Carriages stood ready, their wheels muffled with cloth. Lanterns glowed faintly behind shuttered windows. From a distance the estate resembled a ship moored in mist, waiting to depart upon some unnatural voyage. The gathering, by first light, guests had assembled. They were not neighbors, nor friends in any familiar sense, but members of Etienne Duval's hidden fraternity. Men in dark coats, physicians with leather cases, magistrates with sealed ledgers, and silent women dressed in mourning black, all arrived without fanfare, their carriages disappearing into the fog as if swallowed. Eyewitnesses described them as moving with grave purpose, acknowledging one another with slight nods but never speaking openly. Their conversations, when overheard, were in fragments of Latin, French, or older tongues unrecognizable to most. They carried no gifts, no flowers, only documents and instruments concealed in oiled leather. One servant later testified, "It was not a wedding like folk know, it was like a trial, all come together to bind something. Not man and wife, but something deeper." Isabel prepared. Above, in the locked chamber, Isabel was dressed by two attendants who never met her eyes. She wore a gown of white silk finely sewn, yet the bodice was stiff, almost funereal in its simplicity. A veil was draped over her hair, thin enough to reveal her pallor beneath. Isabel's diary, fragments of which survived through the family's ruin, contains one final entry, dated the morning of October 3rd. The handwriting is faint, ink watered by what appears to be tears. "They tell me today is to be my salvation. I know it is my The veil suffocates. The air burns. I will walk though my legs tremble. If I cannot escape in body, may my soul flee where my flesh cannot." She was led down the staircase at mid-morning. Witnesses described her as more spectre than bride. Her steps slow, her hands clenched white against the fabric of her gown. Some claimed she whispered prayers with every step, though others swore she spoke not prayers but curses. The hall transformed. The great hall, stripped bare in the months prior, had been remade for the occasion. At its center stood a raised platform draped in white cloth. Around it, iron candelabra burned with tallow, their flames wavering in the stale air. Instead of flowers, dried reeds and branches lined the walls, giving the impression of a forest in decay. The guests stood in a circle, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on the dais. At the far end of the platform, Etienne Duval awaited. The groom revealed. Witnesses who recalled Etienne's appearance that day spoke with unease. Even decades later, though he was in his late 60s, his body appeared rigid, almost youthful in posture, though his face bore deep lines. His eyes, once pale blue, had grown clouded, yet glowed with unnatural brightness in the candlelight. He wore a dark coat of antique cut, a garment said to have belonged to his own grandfather. Across his chest lay a chain of gold bearing a medallion inscribed with symbols no one could decipher. In his left hand he carried a worn leather-bound book, in his right, a cane tipped with silver. Etienne stood not as groom, but as hierophant, an officiant of his own ceremony. His voice, when he spoke, carried with it an authority that silenced the whole. The rite begins. At precisely noon, the household clock struck. With its first chime the doors were sealed. Guards posted themselves at every exit. The circle of guests drew tighter, and the hall grew dim as shutters were drawn closed. Etienne opened the book and began to read. The language was neither French nor English, though it carried echoes of both. Witnesses swore it was an older tongue, half prayer, half invocation. At each passage, the gathered answered with murmured responses, as though rehearsed. Isabel stood silent, her veil trembling with her breath. When Etienne turned to her, his words shifted into French. "By blood you are mine, by covenant you shall be mine. In this union, the circle is whole, and the line is preserved against the ruin of war and time." He extended his hand. Isabel hesitated, then slowly lifted her. Some say she moved willingly. Others swear her hand was forced by the attendants at her side. The civil oath. From the shadows the notary Pierre Montfort stepped forward. His presence, though expected, unsettled even the guest. He carried a ledger and quill, his hands trembling as he prepared to inscribe the marriage into legal record. Montfort read aloud the civil contract, his voice faltering. "The union of Etienne Duval and Isabelle Duval of Vermilion Parish is hereby witnessed and affirmed. His words trailed into whispers, drowned by Etienne's own booming declaration. When Isabelle was asked if she consented, her voice barely carried, "I do not." The hall grew still, Etienne's face darkened, yet he did not falter. He placed his hand upon hers and declared, "Her voice is mine, her blood is mine, by my authority. Her will is one with mine." The guests did not object. Instead, they bowed their heads, as though the refusal had been expected, even required. The seal of fire, the final stage of the rite, involved fire. Powder kegs had been arranged in the vault below, candles lit in precise order around the hall. Etienne commanded that torches be lowered into braziers, igniting a smoke that filled the chamber with acrid fumes. He lifted the medallion from his chest and pressed it against Isabelle's palm. Witnesses later described the smell of seared flesh, as her skin blistered beneath the metal. She cried out once, then fell silent, her body rigid. Etienne raised his cane and struck the platform. At that moment, a tremor shook the house, as though the foundations themselves recoiled. Servants fled from the outer rooms, but the guests remained fixed, chanting loud, "Intervention." It was at this precise juncture that interruption came. Accounts differ. Some claim Union soldiers, alerted by deserters from the plantation, forced entry. Others insist it was townspeople, long disturbed by rumors, who gathered courage. Whatever the source, the doors of Maison Duval were battered open. Smoke poured from the hall. Guests scattered into the fog, some vanishing entirely. Etienne, standing upon the dais, refused to move. He raised both arms, as if to shield Isabelle from the intruders, declaring, "She is mine by covenant eternal." Gunfire erupted. Bullets struck the platform, yet Etienne did not fall. Witnesses swore he stood untouched, the book still clutched in his hand, his eyes burning with unholy light. Isabelle collapsed in the confusion, whether from smoke, shock, or wound. None could say. The house in flames, the powder ignited, a roar thundered through the lower vaults, and fire surged upward. The great hall became an inferno. Guests who lingered were consumed. Servants fled into the swamp. Maison Duval burned for 3 days. When the flames subsided, only blackened ruins remained. No bodies were formally recovered, though fragments of bone were later discovered amid the ash. Whether they belonged to Etienne, Isabelle, or others, none could determine. Aftermath. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed Isabelle perished in the fire, bound forever to the cursed house. Others swore she escaped into the fog, her figure seen wandering the bayous for years thereafter, veiled in white, whispering prayers no one understood. Etienne's fate was more contested. Local lore insisted he survived, fleeing westward, under a false name. Others believed his body was consumed, yet his spirit lingered, attached to the medallion lost in the flames. What is certain is that the Duval estate never recovered. The land was seized during Reconstruction, sold in parcels, but no family that settled there remained long. Night voices, strange lights, and the sound of weeping from the ruins drove them away. Conclusion to Part 3. Thus ended the day of the forbidden marriage, a ceremony not completed, yet never undone. The line between union and damnation blurred in smoke and fire, leaving behind only fragments of testimony and a legend that haunts Louisiana to this day. The name Duval, once spoken with wealth and authority, became a curse upon the tongue, and Isabelle, the unwilling bride, became forever the ghost bride of Vermilion Parish. When the fires at Maison Duval at last surrendered to rain and exhaustion, the scene left behind resembled not ruin but battlefield. The central hall was a crater of ash and collapsed beams. The walls, once whitewashed in lime, now stood jagged, cracked, and black as charred bone. In the air lingered a smell that was not merely smoke but of oil, hair, and burnt flesh. Neighbors crept forward reluctantly. Most would not enter. They stood at the periphery of the cane fields, staring at the blackened house, murmuring prayers in French or Latin, under their breath. Those who dared cross the threshold returned pale, insisting the interior was not empty, but still inhabited by whispers, footsteps, and the sharp rustle of silk moving across the ruined stairs. One elderly farmer swore he saw a veil caught in the rafters, fluttering though no wind stirred. Another said a gold medallion glimmered in the ash, only to sink beneath the soot when he reached for it. Federal record. Union soldiers, patrolling the area weeks later, filed an official report. Their account was brief, stripped of the grotesque detail. Villagers whispered. The house known as Maison Duval was destroyed by fire on the 13th day of October 8, cause suspected to be explosive powder kept improperly. No bodies recovered. The estate stands abandoned. Local testimony unreliable. The grounds are unsuitable for quartering. Thus the official record dismissed what the parish knew to be true, that a ceremony had been attempted,
that Etienne Duval had bound his granddaughter in a union forbidden by both church and law, and that something unholy had been stirred in the act. Survivors' testimony. In the months that followed, fragments of testimony surfaced. Servants, once bound to silence, spoke freely after Etienne's presumed death. Their stories converged on one point. Isabelle had not wanted the marriage. They described her pleading, her attempts to flee, her diary entries hidden beneath floorboards, yet their testimonies also diverged in unsettling ways. One claimed Isabelle collapsed in the smoke and never rose again. Another swore she stumbled into the cane fields, coughing, veil torn, and vanished toward the swamps. A third, more chilling, insisted she walked calmly from the burning hall face blank, her hands still branded with the medallion's mark. None could agree, but all agreed on this. Her fate was not natural. The investigators, after the war, Reconstruction officials attempted to seize and redistribute the land. Surveyors were dispatched to map the boundaries and assess the ruin. Their reports, now brittle with age, reveal odd hesitations. The grounds are impossible to measure with accuracy. Instruments falter. Compasses turn erratic. Sounds of voices were heard in the vaults, though no persons were present. The soil is stained with substances not attributable to fire alone. Several surveyors refused to return after the first visit. Those who did pressed their seals reluctantly, as if eager to wash their hands of the estate. Folklore takes root. By the 1870s, the story had already slipped from testimony into folklore. Locals no longer spoke of Etienne Duval by name but of the grandfather who wed his blood. Children were warned not to wander near the cane fields, lest they hear the ghost brides weeping. Hunters swore to see her silhouette crossing the fog, clutching her burned hand as though still bound by the medallion. Songs emerged among field workers.
A family from Mississippi settled near the foundations but fled after 3 of their children died in quick succession from unexplained fevers. By 1890 the ground was left to weeds and cane, a scar upon the parish that no one dared till. Locals insisted the land itself was poisoned, not by fire but by oath. The legend endures. By the turn of the century the Duval name had nearly vanished. The Civil War had erased its wealth, and the fire had consumed its house. Yet the story endured. Travelers through Vermilion spoke of hearing weeping at night, of glimpses of a pale figure veiled in white, wandering the swamps. Some claimed she beckoned to men, leading them astray into quicksand or bog. Others insisted she merely wept, repeating the same words over and over. I do not, I do not, I do not. Thus the ghost bride became a permanent fixture of Louisiana folklore, half warning, half lament, a figure both pitied and feared. By 1900 scholars of folklore began collecting these tales, stripping them of their immediate horror, packaging them as curiosities for the educated. Yet in Vermilion Parish the dread was never academic. For those who lived nearest the ruins the sense was palpable. The marriage had not been completed, yet neither had it been dissolved. Something lingered, bound by oath. Ash and blood. The house was gone, the family scattered, yet the union itself seemed to persist. A marriage between grandfather and granddaughter, not sanctified by man nor God, but etched into the land itself. Conclusion to Part 4. Thus the tale passed from living memory into legend, yet retained its sting. Fires burn out, families vanish, names fade, but what is bound in blood and oath resists decay. The Duval forbidden marriage, born of obsession and secrecy, survived its ruin to become something larger, a haunting, an infection, a warning that still unsettles the Louisiana night. The land stands barren, yet the veil remains. In 1907, during renovations to the courthouse in Vermilion Parish, a mason discovered a metal strongbox bricked into a wall cavity. The box contained little of financial worth, no gold, no deeds, but what lay within was more troubling. There were notebooks brittle with smoke, their pages written in a cramped French hand. They bore the seal of Etienne Duval. For reasons not explained in the surviving chain of custody, the notebooks were never entered into parish inventory. Instead, they were quietly passed to Alphonse Bremond, a physician with an interest in hereditary disorders. Bremond, horrified by their contents, later mailed excerpts to the Louisiana Historical Society before burning the originals. His letters, archived but seldom studied, preserve what he found. Observations of blood. The notebooks read less like a grandfather's diary, and more like an anatomist's ledger. Etienne had tracked Isabelle's growth with disturbing precision. At age 6, notes on her skeletal proportion. At age 10, sketches of her teeth, compared obsessively with casts he had taken of his late wife's jaw. At 12, crude charts of her menses. annotated with remarks about fertility. Worst of all were the blood tables. Etienne pricked Isabelle's skin repeatedly over the years, collecting samples to compare their coagulation, scent, and even taste. He recorded his impressions with a chilling clinical detachment. Her blood is thin, but when mingled with mine, it darkens as though corrected. The union is inevitable. Chemistry itself demands it. Bremond, writing to the Historical Society, remarked, "It is no longer the hand of a planter but of a scientist, though bent to perverse ends." He sees the girl not as flesh and soul but as a vessel of experiment, a tincture to be combined with his own. This is no marriage, it is vivisection in anticipation. The skull measurements. Among the strangest documents were sketches of Isabelle's head, drawn at various ages with lines bisecting the brow, jaw, and temple. Etienne compared these with measurements taken from plaster busts of his ancestors, which he kept in the gallery of Maison Duval. He wrote, "Her brow repeats that of Marguerite, my mother. The jaw echoes mine. Only the eyes betray intrusion of her father's weaker line. This must be corrected. By uniting with me, the fracture will close, and the line will once more resemble its source without deviation." The phrasing echoes theories then emerging in European anthropology, where skull measurement was used to justify notions of purity and superiority. Etienne, though isolated in Louisiana cane fields, was evidently steeped in these currents. He twisted them into a justification for incest, a pseudo-scientific gloss over obsession, correspondence with physicians. The notebooks also preserved copies of letters Etienne had written to unnamed correspondents in Paris and Geneva. He described himself not as a planter but as a custodian of hereditary experiment. He sought counsel on how to maintain purity of line when threatened by dilution. No replies were preserved, yet marginal notes suggest he received encouragement. One entry reads, "Doc confirms degeneration is halted by consanguinity, provided the subjects are selected with precision." He admits church interference, but insists nature herself permits such union. Whether these physicians were real or figments of Etienne's imagination remains uncertain. Bremond noted that several French medical journals of the 1830s contained similar arguments cloaked in scholarly tone, suggesting Etienne may have been influenced by published works rather than private mentors. The chamber below. A particularly vivid notebook describes the construction of a chamber beneath Maison Duval, dug secretly by enslaved laborers in Etienne termed it Le Sanctuaire Sanguin, the blood sanctuary. He detailed its architecture, a table of stone at the center, channels carved to drain fluids, and alcoves where ancestral busts were placed to witness the renewal of the line. Lamps fueled by whale oil provided the only light, casting grotesque shadows across the figure. One page describes Isabelle's first entrance into this chamber at age 13. Etienne wrote, "She trembled at the chill, but I soothed her, telling her this was the womb of our family, where birth and renewal converge. I bade her place her hand upon the stone. She recoiled at its coldness, but soon she will accept it as bridal bed." Bremond's commentary in the margin is brief but searing. This is not science but sacrament inverted. It is desecration disguised as medicine. Physical proof. The strong box contained not only notebooks but fragments. Surgical instruments rusted with age, a lock of dark hair tied in ribbon, and a medallion bearing a sigil not recorded in parish heraldry. The medallion's surface was etched with concentric rings, as if to symbolize unity collapsing inward. When Bremond delivered these objects to the Historical Society, officials refused to exhibit them. Instead, they were sealed in the restricted collection, where they remain to this day, seldom requested and never displayed. Their existence is mentioned only in accession ledgers, each notation marked with the warning, "Do not reproduce without clearance." Isabelle's hand. One final passage in the notebook stands out, dated mere days before the fire of October 13, 1863. It reads, "Tomorrow the hand shall be bound. The mark upon her palm will join with mine, seared by gold and flame. Thus the covenant will be made flesh." He resists. But resistance is irrelevant. The ancestors do not heed consent, only continuity. Historians later noted parish legends describing Isabelle's hand as scarred or branded, even when glimpsed decades later in ghostly form. The source of that legend may well be this entry, preserved in her grandfather's own script. Bremond's conclusion. Bremond's covering letter to the Historical Society closed with words that chilled even his peers. "I have destroyed the bulk of the notebooks lest they be misused by those who might find inspiration rather than warning in their pages. Yet I confess my destruction was incomplete, for the hand that writes history recoils at silence. I leave you these fragments, not to sensationalize but to demonstrate what obsession may accomplish when permitted to mask itself in silence. The Duval affair was not mere scandal, nor even sin, but experiment, one that sought to rewrite the body itself according to the will of a single man. That it ended in fire is mercy. Legacy of silence. The Historical Society never published Bremont's letter. It lay dormant in their files until the 1930s when a graduate student stumbled upon it while cataloging unrelated materials. She too chose silence, noting in her thesis footnotes only. See restricted correspondence, Vermilion collection. Thus the record persisted only in whispers, in archives no tourist could access. Yet even silence has weight. The parish remembered. The fields remained barren, and each October, when fireflies rose in unnatural profusion over the swamp, locals muttered that the blood sanctuary beneath Maison Duval still pulsed. Unseen, its stone channels waiting for fluids long promised. By the early 20th century, the Duval story had thus shifted from folklore to record, from weeping bride to scientific atrocity. The notebooks preserved against intention testified that Etienne's obsession was not madness alone but pseudoscience cloaked in lineage. He sought continuity, and in doing so he transformed kinship into experiment. The house was ash, the family scattered, yet the ledger endured, and with it, the chill truth. Some unions do not perish in flame. They calcify into history, awaiting the next hand reckless enough to open the box. The inferno of October 13, 1863, left Maison Duval a blackened husk. The Civil War still raged, yet in Vermilion Parish the blaze eclipsed even the cannon thunder carried on the wind from distant battlefield. The community whispered. Was it Union raiders? An accident of kerosene? Or retribution from within? When the embers cooled, the survivors were few. Etienne was presumed dead, though no intact remains were ever certified. Isabelle, scarred and silent, was spirited away by a maternal eye. Servants scattered, some fleeing northward with Union detachments, others disappearing into the swamp. What remained was not only ruin, but a legal question. What became of the Duval fortune, and to whom did it rightly pass? The courtroom battles. In 1866, once the Confederacy had fallen and Reconstruction courts reopened, the first suit was filed in Opelousas. Etienne's surviving nephews sought to invalidate any claim Isabelle might hold. Their argument was scandalous but pragmatic, that she was not merely heir but bride, and that her position in the line of succession was thereby tainted. They produced affidavits from neighbors who swore to having heard unholy rites in the gallery, to having seen the girl led by torchlight into the subterranean chamber. The court transcripts note the judge's unease. The testimony, if true, suggests not only mismanagement of estate but crimes against nature. Yet the law cannot anchor itself upon whispers alone. The case dragged for years, punctuated by fiery rhetoric. Attorneys invoked both scripture and civil code, citing precedents as far back as Roman law regarding incest and inheritance. In the end, the Reconstruction courts dissolved, and with them, the Duval estate entered a limbo of perpetual litigation. Medical testimonies. Among the court records lies another disturbing thread: medical depositions. Local physicians were asked to examine Isabelle in 1867, ostensibly to establish her competency as heir. Their findings, redacted in many copies but preserved in a handful of originals, hinted at scars on her palm consistent with ritual burning, as well as signs of long-term coercive union. One doctor, Dr. Gramillion, testified under oath. The subject's constitution is delicate, her nervous condition unstable. She trembles at mention of her grandfather, and though she speaks little, when pressed she utters the word binding repeated. I cannot say more, except that she bears marks I should not expect upon one so young. The transcript cuts off there, as though the court clerk refused to record details. The phantom child. Here the records blur further. A rumor circulated that Isabelle bore a child in 1865, hidden away in a convent near New Orleans. Parish registers from that year list a baptism of a boy, name withheld, mother listed only as I, no father was recorded. The child, if real, disappears from the record. Some claimed he died of fever, others insisted he was adopted by distant relatives, his lineage concealed. A third camp whispered that the boy was malformed, bearing the curse of doubled blood, and that nuns concealed his remains in the convent crypt. Historians searching for evidence have found only partial entries, scratched over as though deliberately erased. Yet the rumor of an heir, the grandson of Etienne Duval, persisted in parish folklore. Reconstruction investigators.
In 1873, a federal investigator named Henry Wainwright, dispatched to Louisiana to audit land claims, wrote a memorandum to his superiors that survives in the National Archives. It reads, "The Duval inheritance presents anomalies beyond financial fraud. Local accounts speak of clandestine rites, of a patriarch who sought to wed his ward. Though I am reluctant to credit such tales, the vehemence of testimony, and the strange reserve with which courts treat the case, persuade me something foul indeed occurred. I advise the department to leave the estate unsettled, for no claimant can emerge without scandal." His recommendation was followed. The land lay in dispute, taxes unpaid, until the property was seized outright by the state. Cane fields once rich with profit became marshland, reverting slowly to wilderness. Folk memory of the heirs. Even as legal ownership dissolved, oral traditions thrived. By the 1880s, children in Vermilion Parish played a game called Isabel's Hand, in which one child pressed a burning stick close to another's palm, daring them not to flinch. The chant that accompanied the game included the line, "Blood to blood, gold to gold, burn the hand, keep the whole." Travelers noted eerie similarities between the chant and the notebook entries later uncovered in night. This suggests that fragments of Etienne's private ritual bled into folk culture long before the notebook surfaced. Another tale claimed that Isabel's supposed child had grown to adulthood, wandering as a mute peddler who refused to show his hands. Each October, he was said to visit the ruins of Maison Duval, leaving small bundles of herbs upon the stone foundation. The decline of Isabel. What became of Isabel herself remains murky. Records show she lived intermittently in New Orleans under her aunt's care, then disappeared from census rolls after a solitary death notice in 1879, issued by the Sisters of Charity, lists an Isabel dying of exhaustion of nerves. No burial site is marked. One nun's journal, preserved in convent archives, describes, "She woke in screams each night of burning walls. She pressed her hand to the floor until it blistered anew, as if renewing a wound that time sought to heal. We prayed but she never ceased trembling." Thus the granddaughter bride, centerpiece of scandal, dissolved into obscurity, her story half hidden by ash and silence. The academic reckoning. By the turn of the 20th century, the Duval affair was no longer litigated in court but dissected in lecture halls. Professors of anthropology and folklore debated whether it was a case of degeneracy, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blood purity obsessions, or simply rural hysteria magnified by Reconstruction politics. Yet none could ignore the
Within that cellar rested a tin trunk, sealed but corroded. Its hinges gave way easily. Inside were papers, brittle yet astonishingly intact. Parish officials were summoned, and within days, scholars from Tulane University traveled to examine the cache. The documents were quickly recognized as belonging to Etienne Duval himself. Their ink, though faded, bore the distinct, looping script of the patriarch. What they revealed would unsettle even the most skeptical academic. The nature of the notebooks. There were 3 volumes, bound in calfskin, warped by water but legible. Each bore no title, only a date. The earliest began in 1849, the latest ended abruptly in October. The first dealt with estate management, cane yields, slave inventories, debts to creditors, but as pages turned, the writing drifted into personal observations. By 1856, Etienne recorded passages less financial than anatomical. He described the curvature of a girl's skull, the angles of her jaw, the purity of her lineage, traced in bloodlines across 3 generations. Scholars later identified the subject as Isabel, then only a child of 8. The second volume delved deeper. Here Etienne sketched diagrams of hands burning, palms pressed to stone, drops of blood caught in cups. He cited Galen, Paracelsus, and fragments of Catholic liturgy, yet warped their meaning into a private theology of fusion and inheritance. The final volume, though fragmentary, contained entries from September 8. In one, Etienne wrote, "Union sanctified by fire, no priest, no law, no mortal court required. She is both branch and root. Through her the line shall coil upon itself, and in that coil strength eternal." The last page bore only ash smudges, as though flames consumed it even as he wrote. Academic reaction. When Tulane professors unveiled excerpts at a 1908 symposium, the reaction was mixed. Some dismissed the writings as evidence of senility, the ravings of a patriarch undone by war and isolation. Others argued they were deliberate, systematic, and chillingly precise, a philosophy of hereditary consolidation taken to its most grotesque extreme. Alphonse Diran, a psychiatrist, remarked, "The Duval manuscripts demonstrate not madness, but method." Their author believed himself custodian of a lineage, and in service of that belief, he sanctioned atrocity. This is not delirium, it is ideology. The press seized upon the story. New Orleans papers ran lurid headlines: Bride of Blood, Plantation Scandal Unearthed. Sensational articles embroidered the facts, inventing ghosts that stalked the swamp, children born eyeless, and phantom bells ringing from the ruins each October. The Swamp Pilgrims. By 1910, curiosity seekers began venturing into the marshes to glimpse what locals now called the Maison Maudite, the cursed house. Lantern-bearing parties picked through reeds and rubble. Some claimed to have heard wailing in the night. Others swore of seeing handprints charred into the cellar wall. A folklorist named Claude Bernier documented these pilgrimages. In his notebook he recorded a song sung by Cajun fishermen: "Burn the hand, bind the kin, ashes fall where fire's been, blood to blood, never part, flame shall weld the broken heart." The melody was lilting, almost a lullaby, yet its content unmistakably echoed the fragments of Etienne's ritual. The cult allegations. Rumors grew darker when in 1912, parish authorities raided a camp deep in the swamp. There they found half a dozen men and women gathered about a bonfire, chanting in fractured French. On the ground lay a child's doll with a palm scorched black. No charges stuck, for the participants insisted it was mere carnival masquerade. Yet in the weeks following, livestock in nearby farms were found mutilated, their hooves burned. Whispers spread that a sect had formed, imitating Etienne's rites. The newspapers dubbed them the heirs of fire. No concrete proof of their existence survives, save for parish arrest ledgers listing the names of 3 men detained and released without trial. Skepticism and suppression. Not all welcomed the growing fascination. Isabel's surviving kin, distant cousins now settled in New Orleans, petitioned Tulane to withdraw the notebooks from public view. They argued the exposure dishonored the family and perpetuated grotesque exaggerations. By 1915, under pressure, the university restricted access to the volumes. Scholars required special permission to view them. This only heightened their allure. Bootleg copies began to circulate, poorly transcribed, filled with errors. Some claimed possession of original pages, though most were forgeries. Yet even forgeries carried influence, inspiring clandestine readings among students of medicine and folklore alike. Testimonies from locals. Meanwhile, Vermilion elders recounted their own memories to folklore. One, recorded in 1917, came from an aged woman who claimed to have been a servant girl at Maison Duval. "I saw him cut her palm and press it to the stone," she cried, "but he held her fast. He said the fire would keep her true." That night the air stank of burning hair, and the walls glowed like coals. After that the house was never right again. Her testimony, though unverifiable, echoed what the notebooks described: a pattern of silence. By the 1920s the story slipped again into shadow. The Great War overshadowed local legend, and Prohibition-era violence filled newspapers with fresher scandal. The ruins sank deeper into swamp, yet the notebooks remained, fragile but intact, locked in an archive vault. Every decade or so, a graduate thesis would revisit them, producing more speculation than certainty. Still, one fact persisted: wherever the notebooks were studied, reports of unease followed. A 1924 scholar noted sudden nosebleeds among 3 students, transcribing passages. A 1931 archivist suffered recurring burns on her hands, though she swore she never touched fire. Such anecdotes were dismissed as coincidence, but in Vermilion Parish, they were whispered as proof that Etienne's rites had not ended, but continued to smolder, reaching across time. Thus, by the early 20th century, the Duval affair transformed from private scandal into cultural contagion. What began as the journals of a single patriarch became folklore, then pilgrimage, then rumor of cult. The notebooks themselves, 3 volumes of ash-stained obsession, were less a record than a spark, igniting fear wherever they surfaced. And yet one volume remained missing. Parish rumor held that Etienne kept a 4th, smaller book, concealed apart from the others, containing the true names and true vows of the ritual. If so, it has never been found. The question thus shifted: what if that 4th book still lies buried, its ink intact, waiting for a hand bold or foolish enough to claim it? By 1937, the Duval notebooks had acquired an aura of dread that transcended their content. They were whispered about not as relics of history, but as living embers, capable of scorching any who drew too near.
Still, scholars could not resist. It was during this year that Professor Henri Boudreau, a historian at Louisiana State University, stumbled upon a peculiar estate ledger in Baton Rouge. Within its brittle pages was an entry that mentioned a quatrième registre, a fourth register distinct from the 3 volumes preserved at Tulane. The ledger, written by a Union officer cataloging confiscated property in 1865, noted, one small notebook, bound in green morocco, withheld from official record at the request of the commanding officer, on grounds of indecency and irrelevance. What became of that notebook was not recorded, yet from this discovery sprang a legend more unnerving than any before. The notion that Etienne's most explicit writings, his marriage vows, remained hidden. Boudreau's obsession. Boudreau became consumed with locating the missing volume. Colleagues warned him that obsession with the Duval affair often led to ruin. Graduate students abandoned dissertations. Archivists developed nervous afflictions. Folklorists vanished into swamps. But he persisted. He combed courthouse records, military inventories, and private family archive. In one letter to a colleague, he confessed, "I feel as though the book itself exerts gravity, pulling me along its orbit. I dream of ash-stained pages. I wake with the smell of burning in my nostrils. Either I find it, or it finds me." By 1941, Boudreau traced the notebook's last known custodian, Major Jonathan Hale, a Union officer who briefly commanded Vermilion Parish during Reconstruction. Hale resigned his post abruptly in 1866, returned north, and thereafter lived in seclusion. His descendants, however, preserved a small collection of his effects, including trunks of documents. The Hale trunks. In 1942, Boudreau traveled to Boston, where Hale's great-grandson permitted him access. Within the trunks were letters, military orders and pamphlets, and at the very bottom of one chest, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a small book bound in green morocco. The notebook was scorched along its edges, its clasp had long since rusted away. On its first page, in Etienne's hand, were the words, "For her, my bride eternal. May this covenant hold beyond death." Boudreau later wrote that in that moment he felt both triumph and dread, as if opening the book also opened a door. Contents of the 4th book. The pages were fewer than in the other volumes, yet their content was far more disturbing. Here Etienne recorded not only his philosophy, but the ceremony itself. He described the night of October 13, 1863, in excruciating detail. The cellar lit by torches, Isabel dressed in white, her palms already scarred from earlier rite. He wrote of binding her hand to his, cutting both with a single blade, and pressing their wounds together over a brazier of burning sugarcane. Most horrific was the vow inscribed in Latin, then repeated in French. "I wed thee, not as grandfather to child, but as root to branch, as flame to fuel. We are one flesh, one fire, one blood unbroken. In this covenant lies eternity." Etienne concluded with a chilling declaration, "If flesh should fail, ash shall remain. If voice should falter, echo shall endure. And if house should burn, the covenant shall not." Boudreau's decline. Possession of the 4th book transformed Boudreau. At first he spoke of publishing a full critical edition, but within months, colleagues noted his health deteriorating. He grew gaunt, his hands blistered as though burned. Though he denied contact with flame, he began lecturing less on Louisiana history and more on heredity, ritual, and the alchemy of lineage. Students reported he muttered in French during lectures words they could not translate. By 1945 he withdrew entirely from public life. A colleague who visited him described his home as reeking of smoke, though no fire burned. On Boudreau's desk lay pages of translation, all centered on the vow of Etienne Duval. In 1947, Henri Boudreau was found dead, seated at his desk. His hands were clasped together, palms charred black. The green-bound notebook had vanished. Rumors of circulation. In the decades that followed, the missing volume surfaced in rumor after rumor. Some claimed it was seized by federal agents, others that it passed through occult societies in New Orleans. A bookseller in Paris reported a mysterious customer attempting to sell him a Cajun grimoire bound in green. But the lead went cold. Each alleged sighting coincided with disturbing phenomena, fires breaking out without cause, families reporting apparitions of a woman in white, and children singing in archaic French. Folklorists concluded that even if the book no longer physically existed, its legend had taken root so deeply that it persisted as cultural haunting. Modern echoes. By the 1960s, the Duval story merged with Louisiana ghost lore. The notebooks were less discussed as history and more as cursed artifacts, akin to the Necronomicon of myth. Teenagers dared each other to recite the forbidden vow said to be transcribed in local libraries. Though no authentic copy exists, still archivists reported that on October 13th of certain years, unauthorized visitors attempted to break into Tulane's vaults, convinced that the original notebooks whispered if left unattended. One archivist swore she returned after midnight to find the vault door warm to the touch, as though heat radiated from within. Historians divide.
What is certain is this. Wherever the rumor of the fourth book spreads, whispers of Isabel return with it, the bride in white, bound to her grandfather by flame and vow, forever seeking release, and so the tale of the forbidden marriage enters the modern age. Not as a closed chapter, but as a question still burning. What if the covenant has never truly ended? For nearly 20 years after Henry Boudreau's death in 1947, little was spoken publicly about the Duval affair. Scholars avoided the topic. Students exhumed as rumors and archivists quietly redacted catalog entries. It was as though the entire state of Louisiana conspired to let the embers cool. Yet silence rarely kills a story. In absence of academic inquiry, folklore thrives, and it was in the 1960s that the tale of the forbidden marriage re-emerged. Not in university halls but in backyards, campfires, and French Quarter taverns. Children dared one another to speak the vow in mirrors. Young couples visiting the ruins near Vermilion Parish claimed to see a woman in white, drifting among the sugarcane. More unsettling still were the reports of sudden fires, barns, sheds, fields igniting without cause, often on or near October. The paranormal surge. In 1963, on the centennial of the alleged marriage, construction workers in Abbeville uncovered human remains while preparing foundations for a shopping center. Local authorities dismissed them as casualties of the Civil War, but the workers swore the bones were bound in ways inconsistent with military burials. Some claimed to have seen silver medallions etched with unfamiliar symbols. Word spread, and soon amateur ghost hunters flocked to the site. That same autumn, police received a rash of calls describing strange lights moving across the abandoned lots. One officer recorded in his report, observed what appeared to be a figure in pale dress moving along unfinished roadway. Upon approach, no person found. Dust and smoke in air, though no fire present. These reports revived curiosity, drawing the attention of folklorists, journalists, and eventually television producers eager for sensational material. The folklorists divide. In the 1970s, folklorist Alma Jefferson began cataloging Louisiana's ghost traditions. She treated the Duval story as cultural memory, an allegory of abuse and secrecy in plantation life. For Jefferson, the forbidden marriage was not literal but metaphorical, a way communities expressed the horror of slavery's sexual violence. But others disagreed. Historian Paul Duran published a controversial paper in 1974 citing property records that suggested intermarriage within the Duval line far more extensive than local custom allowed. He also reproduced excerpts from Boudreau's private notes, including a partial translation of Etienne's vow. Duran concluded, "What we confront is neither myth nor metaphor but a deliberate attempt to fuse heredity and ritual, ensuring a closed circle of blood and dominion. Whether consummated in legal marriage or in ceremony alone, the union of Etienne and Isabel was real and catastrophic." His paper was ridiculed publicly, yet behind closed doors archivists admitted his citations were genuine, fires that would not die. By the 1980s, the Belmont site, long abandoned, had become a magnet for thrill seekers. Graffiti marked the crumbled foundation, broken bottles littered the fields, and each October, small fires erupted, reported in local papers as spontaneous combustion or juvenile mischief. But firefighters often arrived to find no accelerants, no trespassers, no cause at all. One fire chief interviewed off record described a night in 1983. "We arrived to see flames tracing the outline of a house that wasn't there, just bare ground, glowing as if soaked in kerosene, but no fuel, no heat once it died down. Only ash that scattered in the wind." Such accounts cemented the area's reputation as cursed ground. Academic return. In the 1990s, A new generation of scholars, less afraid of stigma, revisited the Duval affair. With digitization of archives, obscure records resurfaced, marriage registers, property deeds, medical notes. Among the most disturbing were medical records from 1850-1860, describing familial deformities in infants born to Duval women. Physicians noted fused fingers, cleft palates, and conditions consistent with consanguinity. One doctor wrote candidly, "The persistence of such traits strongly suggests close intermarriage, perhaps concealed under altered names." These findings lent credibility to Duran's claim. Meanwhile, independent researchers argued that Etienne's notebooks contained early eugenic thinking decades before the term existed, blending pseudoscience, ritual, and domination. For them, the forbidden marriage was both literal act and symbolic culmination of generations of secret voices from the community. While scholars debated, oral traditions among black communities in Vermilion Parish preserved another layer of testimony. Descendants of enslaved families spoke of hearing lullabies sung in a strange dialect on October nights, or of seeing a pale woman calling children toward the fields. One elder recalled her grandmother's warning, "Do not follow the bride when she beckons, for she seeks to take another into the fire with her." These accounts rarely entered official scholarship, dismissed as superstition, yet they persisted with remarkable consistency. The archive fire of 1997. On April 12, 1997, a fire swept through a records facility in Baton Rouge, destroying boxes of probate documents, court filings, and marriage records. Among the losses were several files tied to Vermilion Parish, including duplicates of the October 13th. The blaze was officially ruled electrical, but one archivist swore she saw smoke emanating from a single cabinet hours before the fire spread, though no wires ran near it. The drawer in question, the one containing the Duval file. Thus, even in modern bureaucracy, the pattern endured. Wherever evidence threatened to survive, flame arrived. The Internet age. By the early 2000s, the legend of the forbidden marriage migrated online. Message boards and later YouTube videos recounted versions, ranging from lurid Gothic romance to satanic conspiracy. Teenagers dared each other to drive to the abandoned grounds and film. Some claimed electronic malfunctions, cameras shutting down, batteries draining, audio filled with static. A handful uploaded recordings of faint singing, a female voice repeating phrases in archaic French. Skeptics dismissed these as hoaxes, yet even skeptics acknowledged the persistence of reports tied to a specific date, October 13th, and to a specific motif, the woman in white who vanishes when approached. Thus, the Duval affair, once confined to courtrooms and cemeteries, now circulates freely across folklore, scholarship, and digital rumor. No consensus exists. Was the forbidden marriage literal, allegorical, or both? Did Etienne truly bind his granddaughter in covenant? Or is the tale itself the curse that endures? What is undeniable is the pattern: fire, secrecy, erasure, and reappearance. Each generation believes the story buried, and each finds its own reason to exhume it again. And with each telling, the ash stirs. In every legend there is a moment when the story should die, when the last witness is buried, the final archive consumed, the ruin reduced to soil. Yet the Duval affair has resisted such an ending. It has stretched across centuries, consuming scholars, silencing archivists, and leaving fire in its wake. The family line may have dwindled, but its shadow has not. Survivors dispersed into new names, blood diluted across parishes and state, but in parish courthouses, in hospital ledgers, in whispered confessionals, the echo of Etienne's marriage to Isabel returns with unsettling regularity. One feels almost compelled to ask, was it marriage or was it pact? The Last Bride. In 2003, a graduate student named Clara Viron reported seeing a figure while conducting fieldwork in Vermilion Parish. She described a pale woman in antiquated dress, holding the hem of a ruined gown as she crossed the sugarcane row. Clara approached, calling out, but the figure turned with hollow eyes and raised one hand, as though offering a vow. Then she vanished into smoke. Clara wrote in her thesis, "It is not that the legend survives, but that it insists on being witnessed. The bride walks not because we remember her, but because she demands remembrance." Her advisor struck this passage from the final manuscript. Yet in the years since, Clara has privately admitted the vision haunts her dreams, recurring each October. The Ashen Child. In 2011, a family in Lafayette reported a fire in their backyard. Firefighters arrived to find a circle of ash, with no ignition point. In the center lay a doll of crude cloth, stitched with black thread.
its eyes formed from small pieces of glass. Forensic tests dated the glass to the mid-19th century. The child of the household, a girl of 7, insisted she had not placed the doll there. She claimed instead that a lady in a burnt dress gave it to her, whispering that she would never be alone. The doll was taken as evidence but disappeared from the station overnight. The marriage prayer. Across these centuries, one refrain has persisted. Etienne's vow, spoken in French, appears in fragmented form in dozens of accounts. From Boudreau's notebooks to Durand's transcripts, from tavern ballads to children's rhymes, the words recur, blood to blood, flame to flame. In this union none shall end. Whether spoken as curse, covenant or ritual, it survives in time. Each repetition feels like a reignition, as though the vow itself is the match, the fire that waits. If the Duval legacy ended in the 19th century, then all subsequent fire is coincidence. If the family was merely guilty of cruelty and secrecy, then all visions are hallucinations. If the archives burned through chance alone, then all patterns are illusion. But it is the persistence that unsettles. Every generation sees new sparks. Barnes in 1920, archives in 19, each blaze small enough to escape national attention, large enough to be remembered locally, none explained, all tied to dates or names within the Duval line. It is less like accident than like ritual maintenance, as though the flame must be fed. Whispers among descendants. Some living families unwilling to claim descent, speak privately of illnesses, of children born with strange marks, of an aversion to October's air. They avoid wedding celebrations in that month. They cover mirrors when thunder rolls. They refuse to plant sugarcane. One descendant, interviewed under anonymity in 2019, confessed, "We don't say the names, we don't write the dates, and if anyone tries to make us, we leave." My grandmother said the fire follows the mouth that speaks it. When asked what she meant, the woman closed her eyes and whispered, "Blood to blood, flame to flame." The modern ash. Digital forums are littered with accounts too trivial for scholars, but too consistent to dismiss. Photos of unexplained scorch marks, videos of faint voices repeating vows in static, diaries of people who dream of a woman in white, calling them to witness a wedding. In each the imagery is the same, ash drifting, vows whispered, a bride who cannot rest. It is said that those who read too deeply into the Duval affair dream of her, and in dream she lifts the veil, the unresolved thread. We cannot prove the marriage. We cannot prove the curse. We cannot prove that fire walks with the Duval line, yet neither can we disprove. Every attempt to silence or erase has birthed only new testimony. Every archive burned leaves behind rumor that spreads faster than paper. Every skeptic who writes a debunking finds their words twisted into new folklore. It is as if the story itself hungers, as if the telling is the true ceremony, and with each retelling, we renew the vow. If you walk tonight under Louisiana skies, listen for the hush of cane in the wind. If you see ash at your feet, do not follow. If you dream of a bride in white, do not take her hand. And if you hear the words, even faintly, do not repeat them, for to speak them is to stand in Etienne's place, renewing a marriage that never ended. The fire waits, the vow waits, and once spoken, it will not unbind.